Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. How are you guys doing? So, I'm Michelle, and I'm going to be reading from this book that Jim Stevens wrote. It took him 6 years to put together this book. Um, the, in this book, there are 101 different proofs for the existence of God. 101. So, to me, as I've been reading them, I just really feel some of them are inspired from heaven. Okay, so we're going to start reading. We're going to start reading chapter number 41, proof number 41, and it's called The First Living Cell. Let's take a couple of minutes to think about the origin of life in the very, very first living cell. Many people think about the beginning of life as something that just happened easily and naturally. One small, tiny, simple cell just spontaneously and accidentally appeared. A bunch of chemicals in some goo formed into a blob. Okay, no big deal. If you think that first living cell was just a blob of goo, then it doesn't seem like much of a stretch from pond scum or murky soup of chemicals to a little tiny cell. Some bolt of lightning or other source of energy zapped the chemicals, and voila, suddenly life started. Believers in evolution do not and cannot begin to apply this theory until after life exists and has already started reproducing. Mutation and natural selection, the processes of evolution, cannot operate until there is already life reproducing itself. The theory of evolution does not explain where everything before life came from or how life itself got started. The theory of evolution cannot explain this. It's obviously, therefore, a sort of religion requiring faith. But for right now, let's think about that first living cell a little more deeply, given what we now know about living cells. If we can't get the first living cell without there being God, then the theory of evolution is doomed because it never functions until there is life. What are some of the qualities that first living cell had to have in order for life to exist in it? We now know from biology there are certain basic requirements for life to exist, and the whole process is extremely complicated. A single living cell is now considered more complicated than a Cray supercomputer. Suppose you laid all the individual parts for an automobile out on your driveway. Can you now imagine any possible scenario that could take place in the next billion years where those parts get organized by some natural, without no intelligence being added, process into a fully functioning car that you could someday drive away? There could be lightning bolts, hurricanes, floods, windstorms, asteroids, whatever, but nothing is going to assemble anything. With all the microscopic research done in cell biology, and then here he puts this most incredible picture of a cell. You'll have to get the book because the diagrams are really amazing. Okay. With all the microscopic research done in cell biology, we now know that even a single tiny little cell is like a busy little city. It is much more complicated than an automobile. Even if you had all the chemicals necessary for life in one place, like a swamp or a deep ocean setting, getting it organized into some form of first living cell is on the order of complexity of simultaneously assembling all the different cars in America. Here is a short list of some of the attributes that would have been necessary for the first living cell. There are others that you can find in the research if you want to go into more depth. I'll expand on some of these later on after we read the list. Number one, reproduction and inheritance. The first living cell had to be able to reproduce a second living cell, or there would never have been any more life. It also had to pass on its genetic characteristics by some mechanism, such as DNA. Number two, cell membrane. There had to be a wall around the contents of the cell to hold in the material. Otherwise, it would drift away or be destroyed by other chemical processes. The cell membrane also has to be permeable, though, to let chemicals go in and out. It must also be able to grow in size. Number three, digestion for energy. Life requires a process to get energy. There had to be a system for breaking down chemicals and converting it to get energy out of them. It's like this bird. He's accompanying me. Oh, okay. Number four, protein production. There had to be a system for making proteins and enzymes, or it could never reproduce itself. There are 20 basic amino acids that are necessary for all the known life forms. Number five, repair capability. All DNA and RNA molecules are subject to harmful mutations and damage from other chemicals. There had to be a process of repairing them when they are multiplied. Six, elimination of waste. There would need to be a process for getting rid of used up chemicals. Seven, respiration. Most of life forms take in oxygen in some way. Scientists are still debating if the first living cell would have required a process of taking in oxygen. So, this is a very, very amazing list of abilities required for life. I might also have included growth as the eighth property, and a ninth property might be sensing and responding to the environment. To go from a goo of chemicals to a fully functioning living cell that meets the above requirements without any intelligence applied seems a lot less likely than assembling an automobile. You might be able to imagine how one or two of the above processes or systems could have happened, but all of them is not reasonable or logical. Let me quickly mention a couple of famous headlines about scientists creating life in the laboratory. First is the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953. They put the hypothesized original chemicals in a test tube and hit it with a bolt of electricity. The result was the formation of some amino acids, less than 10, the so-called building blocks of life. even though this experiment is still found in a lot of science textbooks. It has been fully discredited because the early Earth's atmosphere was not like they hypothesized and put in their test tubes. And even if they got some amino acids, it takes 20 to build a protein. That's like getting only some of the simplest car parts on your driveway. It's not a functioning car. Good example. Second, on May 20th, 2010, Craig Venter, a pioneer in human genome research, was able to synthesize a living bacteria. It was hailed as creating life. What they did was figure out the DNA of an already living cell. They were able to synthesize a genome of over 1 million DNA base pairs sequence using very complicated processes and millions of dollars. One part of the process required yeast to help copy the DNA because a machine cannot do it. At one point, there was a mistake of a single base pair missing, and it wouldn't work. It took them 3 months to find the error and then make the copy correctly. They then inserted this DNA back into an already living cell with its DNA removed. So, if you call that creating life, you have to ignore the fact that all they really did was copy the DNA of life that already existed. Oh yeah. Even then, they had to put the DNA they copied back into a previously living cell for it to function. The cell of cytoplasm, where they put the DNA already, had a cell membrane, and the systems required for cellular tasks like carrying sugars, copying DNA, removing wastes, converting energy, regulating production speeds, communicating with the environment, and so on. This is an amazing accomplishment, to be sure, and I don't want to minimize it. But look at all the intelligence that has gone into it. It has taken some really, really smart people 15 years to get this far, and they've barely started. So how much intelligence will it take before they can create life, if ever? Will they still try to claim life happened accidentally with no intelligence behind it? That would be laughable at this point. Okay, back to the list of requirements for life. Requirement number 1, reproduction. Think back to biology class in school where you learned about mitosis and cell division. The first living cell had to be able to do that all by itself the very first try. Otherwise, there would be no second living cell. We know that all reproducing cells contain DNA, a very complicated molecule. It is the mechanism that inherits the characteristics of the cell to the next generation. The simplest life forms must have a DNA molecule of thousands of base pairs. It would have to somehow decide to split in half and make an exact perfect copy of itself. Then the two strands would have to separate into two different areas of the cell, and the cell membrane would surround each one and split into two new cells. Evolutionists have to believe that the DNA pre-exited the first living cell. It could not logically have formed accidentally at the same time as the cell membrane formed or after the cell already existed. However, DNA is too complicated to last outside a cell. This idea has basically been deemed unlikely because DNA cannot exist for long without protection from harmful mutations and serious breakdown from contact with oxygen and other chemicals and ultraviolet light. Number 2, cell membrane. There has to be a cell membrane to surround the cell. Otherwise, you don't have a cell. But a cell membrane is an extraordinary boundary. If you have ever seen an animation of what's happening all the time with the membrane that surrounds a living cell, you will be amazed. You probably did science experiments in school with osmosis. Well, osmosis is going on all the time with nutrients, water, oxygen, wastes, and other chemicals passing in and out of the cell through the membrane. Just where did the membrane around the first living cell come from? Could something like that have been floating around in the soup too at the same time as all the perfect chemicals and scoop them up and then close the whole thing like a fishnet? I think this is getting too long, but as you can see, each well-established attribute of a living cell that is listed above would require more intelligence than we currently have in the world of science. So there must be God. Okay, thank you so much, Jim. Yeah. Wow. Okay. He's said it all. Thank you so much for listening. And the next proof, oh my goodness. The next proof we're going to be reading is about bats. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good day. All right, bye.